panelists, and we're just kicking off the recording there. So yeah, but as I said, I'm going to introduce myself, the panelists, read the panel description, and we'll take it from there. All right. So here's what we're going to be talking about today. Florida, our wonderful state of 21 million people, 22, 23 million. Florida's electricity mostly comes from burning natural gas, which is mostly methane. It's a fossil fuel that warms the atmosphere even faster than carbon dioxide. And to avert the worst impacts of climate change, uh, society has to figure out a way of generating electricity from a different source. And we also have to figure out ways of reducing the amount of methane that goes into the atmosphere from a bunch of industrial and agricultural processes. That is expensive and tough. So cities are increasingly turning to something they see as a bridge to carbon neutrality, to less greenhouse gas emissions. It's a technology called biogas or renewable natural gas. What is it? And what role is it going to play in our clean energy transition? Today, talking to us about this exciting subject is panelist Nick, and please correct me if I'm pronouncing this incorrectly, Ciancio, Chief of Resilience for Miami-Dade County's Department of Solid Waste Management.
Que está bien fuchileándose.
Oh,
No
sir,
te
if I would just...
fuchileaste. Y entonces, ¿por qué bajaste la válvula del baño?
Thank you. Nick is somebody who has to deal with a lot of methane. Panelist Dylan Chase, who is the public relations manager for the Renewable Natural Gas Coalition, and a panelist, Susan Glickman, who I would say needs no introduction, but she's a longtime climate action advocate and the current vice president for policy and partnerships at the Clio Institute. Well, folks, that's our panel. Normally, I would have had some witty banter with Alex to fill about a minute here, but she's otherwise engaged. So I'm just going to go for the first big question. And the first big question goes to Nick. Nick, what is renewable natural gas and how is it different from normal everyday natural gas?
Apologies, Nick, give me 1 second. That's my fault. Okay, try it now.
Wonderful, thank you. I appreciate it. So first and foremost, thank you for having me. Like Mario mentioned, I'm the Chief of Resilience for the Department of Solid Waste Management in Miami-Dade County. Really glad to be speaking on such an important topic during such an important time. You know, here in Florida and across the United States and across the globe, we're constantly reminded of just how significant the impacts are to climate change, and the folks on the west coast of Florida are particularly aware of that today, and we have them in our thoughts. So renewable natural gas, when people first hear about this topic, it's sort of a misnomer, right? Like Mario was mentioning, natural gas is a fossil fuel, and most individuals have learned since they were younger that fossil fuels are a non-renewable resource, meaning that they are limited in the amount that we have to use. And natural gas and coal are two very good examples of fossil fuels that are non-renewable. So what is renewable natural gas? Now that we've addressed that it can be interpreted as a misnomer, renewable natural gas is a fuel source that is dependent on a renewable source. So renewable natural gas can come from wastewater treatment plants. It can come from animal facilities where a lot of manure is being generated. It can come from anaerobic digesters, so facilities that take in a lot of food waste, and it can come from, in our case, landfills. And the reason why it's called renewable is because all of those waste streams, whether that be biosolids from humans or biosolids from animals or food waste, or municipal solid waste, all of those are considered ever generating. And so that's why it's referred to as renewable natural gas as opposed to natural gas. Natural gas is limited in the amount, given that it's a fossil fuel and it can take millions of years to form. Renewable natural gas relies on the generation of waste streams that are made every day.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Nick. The next question goes to Dylan. Dylan, how common is it for cities, farms, companies to be out there collecting the methane that comes from human biological flows, anthropogenic flows? How common is this technology, and how are we seeing this industry grow over the last few years?
Well, first, thanks for having me, Mario. Looking forward to a good discussion here. Once again, I'm Dylan Chase, Public Relations Manager for RNG Coalition. We're the trade group representing renewable natural gas interests in North America. And I work on the communications end, so I get to help tell the story of RNG in North America, which, to your question, Mario, it's a growth story right now. For a little historical context, the first landfill gas to energy facility was opened in the US in Staten Island back in 1982 at the Fresh Kills landfill. And from that point until 2011, when RNG Coalition was founded, development was pretty slow. There were 31 operational facilities when we were founded in 2011. And at last check, we are currently at 435 operational facilities today. We surpassed 300 facilities last year, and just from last year to this year, we surpassed 400. And then we have another 455 across North America under construction or planned, so 500 is well within view. Obviously, policy is really important to that development in supporting the growth of this industry, as it is with any clean energy technology. And that's part of RNG Coalition's role is advocating for the sustainable development of these facilities, in part through policy advocacy. And then even more broadly, and I try and wrap things into a global perspective. Nick did a really good job of summarizing what RNG is and how the name, can impact people's perceptions. At some point today, I'm going to try and talk about the global perspective as well, because it really is a global movement. It's called biomethane in other parts of the world. We were intentional in our founding in 2011 and using the phrase renewable natural gas to try and draw a connection with folks about all the natural gas we could displace with RNG. But yeah, just to round out, it's becoming increasingly common, and really it isn't showing any sign of slowing down, Mario.
It's interesting. That's a very steep growth curve there, Dylan. Thanks for filling us in on that. Susan, so as I understand it, Florida's pretty dependent on natural gas in its current form for energy. What are cities and states doing to switch to other more renewable sources of that energy?
Well, they're not doing enough. So we start with, in 2005, when Jeb Bush was governor of Florida, we were 48% reliant on gas. And in fact, they held a energy summit for the first time, really, in the Florida Capitol. I was there. And as I like to say, he was kind of hair on fire for this need for fuel diversity, because we do very little historically and to this date on energy efficiency, which many states really, see energy efficiency as a significant, part of their fuel mix, if you will. Very little on solar. And at that time, we passed a policy to allow the utilities charge in advance for new nuclear power plants that never got built in Florida, which in Duke territory was about $3 billion that they took from ratepayers for absolutely nothing. And we also had a proposal that Jeb Bush was pushing to add coal-fired power plants in the state of Florida to achieve fuel diversity. None of those happened. It was sort of a really momentous time fighting back these proposals that Florida Power and Light and others had to build coal-fired power plants. So we never achieved any fuel diversity in that regard. And now we are as much as 80% reliant on fossil fuels and gas. Some of the areas or some of the utilities have higher gas than others. So what we have here, though, is, and I like to say, when you're a hammer, everything you see is a nail. And so what happened in Florida is we grew this gas industry. Next Era Energy, which is the parent company for Florida Power and Light, our biggest utility in the state, and then Duke Energy had built a pipeline So they built a pipeline from Alabama that comes down to the Orlando area. Spectra built it, and lo and behold, our then Governor Rick Scott, now our junior senator, had an investment in that pipeline. And at that time, there were many obstacles to wetlands and so forth that they all managed to sort of push through. So when you set up this gas infrastructure, and simultaneously the legislature has made it easier to site gas storage facilities over a number of years, rather than encouraging energy efficiency and solar and clean forms of energy. So when you build this infrastructure, then you're going to need to find customers for this pipeline. And that's what's been going on for the last several years. And we've seen from the Jacksonville utility that Florida Power and Light tried to buy, to the governor removing the board of the Gainesville utility, and even down to Orlando Utility Commission, which in 2020 locked into 2 decades of additional gas when they didn't capture the energy efficiency and didn't take advantage of their rooftop solar. So there has been an effort, and like many other things in our society, this is about making money. And so now that you've locked in this pipeline and locked in these gas customers at 80%, rather than diversifying our fuel sources and our fuel mix with real renewables. So when I hear, and some of these projects that I'm hearing about, Nick, from Miami-Dade County sound really interesting to me, because we do have a lot of methane coming out of landfills, and we do need to capture that. But also my spidey sense goes up sometimes too when I hear phrases like renewable gas, or even some of the efforts to do hydrogen, because sometimes those efforts are efforts to kick the can down the road and to continue burning fossil gas. In some of these hydrogen projects, there's sort of, it reminds me of, the Wicked Witch of the North and, the Wizard of Oz. Are you a good witch or a bad witch? It's like, is this a good hydrogen project or a bad hydrogen project that uses this tiny little bit of gas or, or renewables, and just continues to lock in these products? So we need to move away from gas at all levels. But there are good forms where we take, the methane from the landfills. Methane is, as you said, extraordinarily potent, and we need to get organics out of the landfills. I mean, these are things that we need to do. I'll wrap it up by saying the solutions to transitioning to clean energy, which we have to do, are many. And I think that's why it's daunting. We're sort of instant gratification people, and we want these big solutions. So we need to do the landfills and the wastewater treatment plants, and we need to figure out, the best way, to run those on clean energy. So anyway, I sort of take these as a project by project, kind of thing, because when someone says renewable gas, sometimes that's a good thing. And sometimes I think it's greenwashing. So again, project by project.
Thank you so much, Susan. Yeah, and I think a key word here has been displacement, right? What is the possibility for renewable natural gas to displace the gas that we're piping in through that Spectra pipeline? But Nick, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about how Miami-Dade County is hoping to use the technology. The dump in Miami, or our dumps, are some of the largest single point sources of methane in the entire state, right? It's smelly, it's a lot of climate forcing gas, but it's also a possible energy source. Do you think, or can you tell us a little bit about what the plans might be there and how it might help slash emissions?
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate Susan's perspective there as well. Just because it's really important to recognize where some of these sources of natural gas are. So in regards to landfills, so I'll try to take a step back and give about a 30,000 overview before I talk about what Miami-Dade County is wanting to do. We know, and if you don't, much of the methane that is being generated in landfills is primarily because of organic waste that's being disposed of in the landfill. So what generally happens is anything from an apple core to your half-eaten pasta to the yard waste that you have, that if that gets put into a landfill, that will ultimately be covered up with dirt and then layered with more waste and dirt. And the environment that that fosters is an anaerobic environment, or an environment without oxygen. And that's where you start to see the generation of methane. Like was mentioned, methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. 28 times has a 28 times global warming potential to CO2 over 100 years. If you look at how long methane stays in the environment, about 20 years, it's actually 80 times more potent. So it's critical that we find a solution to how we're dealing with methane. So Susan had mentioned diverting organics from landfill, and Miami-Dade County is working on identifying ways to divert as much organic waste from landfill as possible. And we have some yard waste diversion pilot programs as well, and are exploring opportunities to expand on that. But the question becomes not what do we do with the organic waste that is going to be or could be disposed in the landfill. The question becomes, what do we do about the organic waste that's been disposed of the landfill yesterday, 5 years ago, 15 years ago? And the problem is that, yes, Miami-Dade County, so the county as a whole has 2 landfills that are county owned. They're both expected to reach capacity by the end of the decade. And so some people think that, all right, if we're not diverting, let's say we don't divert any organics, right? Even though we are currently diverting some organics, let's say we don't divert any, or we divert all of them. It doesn't matter how much waste goes into the landfill between now and 2030, because what's ultimately going to happen is all of the organic waste that's been disposed of in our landfills up until now will continue to generate methane for at least the next 30 years. So even if we don't put in 1 more pound of food waste, or 1 more pound of yard waste, or 1 more pound of that half-eaten pasta, we have already locked in methane generation in our landfills. And it's important to recognize that this is not unique to Miami-Dade County. Like Dylan mentioned, there are a few hundred landfills that are working on RNG projects, but there are a lot of other landfills that are not. And what ends up happening is, if you're generating methane, as landfills do, if it's of a certain size, you don't even have to capture the methane. You don't even have to capture the methane. However, ours is of a certain size and of a certain age where we are required under the EPA to capture our methane. And the question becomes, what do you do with that methane? And so the landfills that are required to capture the methane, if they're not doing an RNG project, a renewable natural gas project, what they're doing is they're flaring it. So they're already combusting the methane, right? Because when you combust methane, you create CO2. So it is better to combust methane and generate CO2. That is known. But what's even better is if we're already going to be generating the carbon dioxide emissions from combusting the methane, it'd be best if we could displace a fuel source with that RNG, right? Because if we're using diesel-powered vehicles, for example, and those diesel-powered vehicles are going to generate carbon dioxide. And if we're going to continue flaring our methane, that'll generate carbon dioxide. But the thinking is, what if we could generate renewable natural gas, right, and use that to power our vehicles? So that way we're only combusting fuel once rather than having fuel combustion twice. And so what Miami-Dade County is doing is we've analyzed how much methane we're generating, and we're developing a request for proposal to help identify how we could effectively use our methane. That way, we can acknowledge that we're still going to be generating this greenhouse gas, but perhaps we can be using it for beneficial use.
Mario, I just wanted to make one quick comment on that. And you're also not having to transport it, right? So if you use that right where you're generating it, then, and with something like methane and gas in general, leakage is a problem, right? However you're transporting it. So anyway, I know Miami-Dade's Mayor Daniela Levine Cava has been an amazing leader on climate issues. The whole issue of waste in general is unbelievably challenging. But 16% of the organics that go into landfills is really usable produce, and we can do something about that.
Wonderful. Well, that was absolutely mind-blowing. Dylan, some sort of big picture questions, right? Aside from Mount Trashmore, as we like to call it, or the dumps and the landfills, what are some other sources of renewable natural gas in general? And just for my own knowledge, right? And you don't necessarily have to have this figure on you. I'm just getting very curious right now. What is the total estimated generation capacity in the state of Florida, right? Like I'm just curious, like, all right, well, how much of this stuff is out there that we could burn? Dylan, please take it away.
Sure. Yeah. I actually do have some figures for you, so get ready for some statistical vomit here. By our estimates, 67% of RNG feedstocks come from municipal solid waste. Another 24% comes from agricultural waste. So that's, largely dairy farms. Another 5% is from food waste, and these are North American figures, mind you, and 4% from wastewater reclamation facilities. Now, in terms of total volume displacement, I mean, in Florida, we're talking about 4 operational facilities right now. So, the state is really, it's just got a kernel of an industry at the moment. You compare that to California, where there's over 150 operational facilities. Texas offers a lot of volumes with a lot of really large landfills in particular. We do keep track of total, North American and US estimates of growth, although that's not something we create ourselves in-house. Just to give for reference, Wood Mackenzie and Deloitte have estimated that RNG could displace between 3 to 5% of all natural gas in North America within 25 years. ICF back in 2019 went a little higher and estimated it could be somewhere between 5 to 12% of total US gas demand. NYSERDA in New York has looked at this as well, just for New York State, and has estimated that if you use around 50% of all RNG feedstocks, you could produce gas to around 11% of all gas demand within New York State by 2040. Now, one thing I'd like to press home here is that here in North America and in the US and in Florida and individual states, we actually are a bit behind Europe in setting tangible and concrete goals for building out what's known as biomethane over there. They've made RNG biomethane a really key part of its plan to get away from Russian oil and gas. Oliver Wyman, the consultancy, has estimated, for instance, that biomethane could replace around 9% of all gas in Europe by 2030. So that's just a few years away. And they've set some really lofty targets to 12x their biomethane supply in pretty short order. I could talk about Denmark, what they've done. They're running 40% of their gas system on RNG at present, and they're trying to shoot for 100% biomethane use in their gas system by the early 2030s. So in the US, we're not Denmark, right? Like, we're a very big country. But if those volumes sound small in any regard, I would frame that more in terms of just how much natural gas we use. And to Ms. Glickman's point, we need to move away from being so dependent on fossil fuels. Long term, if you look at the EIA and other, authoritative sources of data, estimates are we're going to be declining our gas use as we build more renewables into the grid. But, our focus is if we can replace 5%, 10%, 15% of those, fossil molecules that you have to frack or get out of the ground and do, exploration and production activities for, all the better.
Right. Yeah. No. Those are some stunning figures, and it seems that there's certainly a growth industry here. Susan, clearly landfill, dairy, sewage systems, they're all pretty decent sources of greenhouse gas emissions. What are some other ways that people are tackling that other than harnessing it for RNG?
Well, you can work with the agriculture community. Miami-Dade is a really good example. Most people have no idea that there's a significant agriculture community in Miami-Dade because we think of sort of the urban and Miami Beach and all of that. You can work with the producers because they know when they're going to have overage. And what if we actually just take that produce and get it to the schools or into a correctional system and, get healthy vegetables into people's food sources. So you just get it out up front. The waste issue is something I've spent a lot of time, sort of thinking about it, and I, analogize it to sort of a big, giant, enormous swimming pool with about 28 different swim lanes, because you've got to deal with fabrics differently, right? Then you're going to deal with the organics. And so it's just super challenging. Recycling, China used to buy our recycling garbage and they don't anymore, but there still is a market for paper. Right. So you have to isolate certain things. And again, that's why I made the comment earlier about, as people who are drawn to instant gratification, there's no instant gratification here. It is a complicated process which requires people to, have certain behaviors with recycling, but we can do more there. So we have to take each piece that we possibly, can. And I know Miami-Dade bought one of the first electric garbage trucks. So and again, not uncomplicated. Miami-Dade only controls 20% of their garbage. And so there are a lot of issues there. But we have to do this, we just have to think a little differently. It's not sort of a negative, the whole issue of moving to clean energy. Some people feel like that has to be sacrificed. And Mario actually wanted to take issue with something you said in the intro about it being super expensive. Not necessarily. If we do these things right, it may cost less than, energy efficiency always was cheaper. And right now, solar is cheaper than gas. That's just a fact. So, these things evolve. One of the reasons Florida is so important and things when you do these pilots are incredibly important is you got to see what works well. And then you really dig in and you build a market. Right? Like we all owe Germany a debt of gratitude when they committed probably 15, 20 years ago to clean energy because they did a lot of solar and it brought the cost down. So Florida is the second largest market for electric vehicles. So as you build markets, then the costs come down. Solar is cheaper than gas. So we got to dig in and explore. And again, gratitude to Miami-Dade because they're doing, cutting edge things in a number of places. They're doing a pilot with the Florida Department of Environmental Protection with a company called Chemergy, where they're using a hydrogen bromine chemistry to treat biosolids. They used to take, and I guess still do at some level, biosolids 7 counties up and land apply it. Like that's not a good idea for a whole lot of reasons. So again, you've got to figure out how to capture these sources of energy, waste heat. We've got just hundreds of solutions that we sadly kind of ignore because there are big, entities, industries, companies that make money off selling certain products. So the folks, NextEra, Duke Energy, Governor Rick Scott, who has tens of millions of dollars invested in liquefied natural gas. Dylan, you mentioned something earlier, how, the Russia attacking Ukraine and sort of the need, for energy fuels is, sort of driving this idea that we're going to somehow liquefy natural gas and ship it to Europe. That is just not an efficient use. Someone will make money off of it, and you have leakage all the way. So, I'm sitting here today as a essentially homeless person. My home, in an area that I've lived in since 1993, which has never flooded before, saw, 2.5 feet of seawater. And now we're looking at, that's Hurricane Helene, and now we're looking at Hurricane Milton. And I wish we could have some better names for these hurricanes, right? Can everybody agree on that, right? Kind of lousy names, but here we go. We're being told that there may be twice as much storm surge, up to 12 feet. So the climate pollution that we are putting out from gas, from coal, concrete products, a number of things, but, largely these fossil fuels is trapping heat. It's causing ice, glacier sheets to melt, raising sea rise, warming our Gulf of Mexico and ocean temperatures that are causing these supercharged storms and storm surge. And so it seems to me that the people who are invested in gas and then feign ignorance as to understanding what's causing this storm surge, are really accountable or should be held accountable, but they bear responsibility in the tragedy that we're seeing, the loss of life, the loss of the people we love and the places we love. And so as soon as I finish this session, we're going to be evacuating, and I'm caring for my friend's 90-year-old mother who's been living on the beach. So this isn't an abstract conversation about, getting organics out of the landfill. Like, this is for real what we have to do now before we turn, and it isn't just Florida. It's drought, it's wildfires. Like, this is happening all over, and as the American Lung Association used to say, when you can't breathe, nothing else matters. So let's find those sources, the renewable gas, we use it on site. Like, we have to get really smart about what we're doing here. And we have 95% of the solutions we need to address the climate crisis. We need innovation in shipping and aviation and so forth, but let's get going. Let's capture the cost-effective efficiency. Let's use the solar. And Florida doesn't do that, right? Out of 52 utilities around the country, Florida Power and Light, our biggest utility, is 52 out of 53 in offering energy efficiency. Like, that's wrong, and it's an equity issue because affluent people get more efficient all the time. Our bills are going through the roof because we are over reliant on fossil gas. That's just pretty simple. And I think, some of this is complex, but I think it's pretty easy to understand. So I just, once again, and I've been doing this for 24 years, call on policymakers and the public, because climate's something the individual takes action on as well as the policy that we need. And we need both. We need global, world policy, national policy, state and local. And you asked earlier, Mario, over time, a lot of the local governments have stepped up. We have a South Florida Climate Compact, and we've already heard about Miami-Dade, who leads, is very much a leader, Broward County, Tampa Bay. I mean, there is leadership. And the Biden-Harris administration, with the Inflation Reduction Act, around the country, put out about $80 million grants for climate pollution, reduction plans. And of course, there's also, funding and tax credits and different things going on. So we have got to move with exponential speed, or we're just going to see more Helene's, more Miltons, more camp wildfires out in California, more drought. And I guess I don't know if I'm more sad or mad, but I certainly am frustrated with the lack of leadership.
No, absolutely. And this is a tough time. Dylan, Nick, a word on moral hazard, a question to you two, right? Obviously, humans produce a lot of methane from their activities that doesn't get burned for fuel. And it's a good idea to burn that methane for fuel because it's going to break the methane up and make it less impactful for the climate. But it's also true that a lot of organizations and corporations that burn methane that comes from other sources may have an interest in taking advantage of this process and of the tax breaks and the abatements in order to continue to burn methane that comes from the ground and that doesn't come from a natural human process. How do you think about moral hazard in this industry? How do you think about projects that close the circular economy loop or don't? And I'd love examples from both of you if you know.
Sure, I'll go first. First, I appreciate Susan sharing her personal perspective and how climate impacts are affecting her. I think most folks can look, if they have their eyes open, they can look somewhere in their life and find somewhere where they've been impacted. I'm actually in Orlando right now, house sitting for my sister while she's away on her honeymoon in California. I called her on the phone yesterday and she couldn't breathe because of the wildfires. Meanwhile, I'm kind of battening down the hatches for Hurricane Milton coming in here. And so when we talk about moral hazard, I think the right way to think about things is just going back to the problem of methane emissions. If unchecked, we're talking about 12% of all greenhouse gas emissions in the United States, according to EPA, are from methane. And when we talk about global warming potentials, again, we're talking about something 20 to 80 times as impactful, depending on what time scale you look at compared to CO2. Now, is there moral hazard? I think part of when we talk about moral hazard, or I think like inherent in that question is the idea of greenwashing. For one, I think it's important to have advocates like Ms. Glickman looking at project by project, and we'll disagree about what the, how projects should be or the end commodity should be deployed. But I do think it's important to have folks looking to enforce accountability on corporate actors or municipalities, whoever else. It takes a lot more than just policy to make sure that we actually conduct an energy transition in a sustainable way that's best for future generations and not just lining folks' pocketbooks. That said, I do think it's important to emphasize that sometimes an economic incentive can be very important in helping build out a clean technology. You look at California and the success they've had with clean fuel programs. They've displaced over 60% of all dirty diesel in the state with cleaner alternatives because of regulatory programs that are enforced there that help put cleaner molecules, which, by scientific measure, have a lower carbon intensity than do, diesel options. And that's a big win. So when we talk about moral hazard, again, it has to be case by case. I do think it's important to have folks working on all ends of the advocacy spectrum and holding corporate actors and whomever else accountable. But one last point I'll leave you with is that, the term greenwashing does get thrown out a lot in today's political climate, in a very polarized political climate. And I think it is important to think about what we're talking about when we use that word, because it's kind of a scarlet letter. And once you've used it, it can be really tough. I talked to some folks in the general public who have heard about RNG one time or two times, and they read an article that said it was greenwashing, and that's fixed in their mind. And that is challenging when you look at the potential we have to actually move a little bit away from more E&P activities and fracking and other activities, and towards something that is tapping a resource that is renewable. To Nick's point, the World Bank estimates that globally landfill waste is going to increase 70% by 2050. We're going to keep producing waste. Now, I've got a coffee here. It's got oat milk in it. I don't drink dairy milk, but guess what? Folks like dairy products, and they're going to keep eating ice cream, and they're going to keep drinking milk. And as long as that's the case, you're going to have manure. So that is really where we focus, is capturing that methane and then downstream making sure that it's displacing fossil gas or diesel.
All right. Nick, is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, well, first and foremost, I have to thank Susan for singing Miami-Dade County's praises in some of the work that we're trying to do. Florida and California, as time goes on, you might as well add to the lists of states that are prone to climate change. But Miami-Dade County and Pinellas and Hillsborough County, where St. Pete and Tampa are, they're the epicenter of climate change in the United States. And so that's one reason why Miami-Dade County tries to be a leader and an innovator in these areas, just because, everyone's impacted by climate change, but we quite literally see it on our back door. We see the sea level rise, we see the king tides, we see when we can't cross the street how we used to be able to 10 years ago during rain events. Now, regarding this moral hazard, I think I understand what you're getting at, Mario, and I think that's a really important thing to consider. But to Susan's earlier points, we need to be reducing our climate impact as quickly as possible. So, for example, Susan mentioned that Miami-Dade County has deployed an electric garbage truck, and we've deployed a few compressed natural gas garbage trucks as well. The county has a goal of getting 30% of our electricity from solar by 2030. And that's on-site solar, not purchase of RECs or what have you. So we recognize that there is the potential for greenwashing in certain areas, but if we're serious about combating the climate crisis that we're in, we have to look at where emissions are being generated. And like I mentioned earlier, our landfills are generating methane, and currently we're burning that methane for carbon dioxide. We could use that methane for beneficial reuse, like in compressed natural gas vehicles. And we'll continue to generate methane in our landfills for quite some time. And I think one of the challenging components of this. Susan, I mean, this is great. I get to play off of so much of what she said. We've got the solution. 95% of the solutions are already presented to society. And that can be really stark, right? Because a lot of people, they might feel like there's not a lot of action, or if they don't live in Miami-Dade County where they see the CNG truck or the electric vehicle truck or some of the innovations that we're doing, if they don't see those things, they might feel like not a lot of action is being done. And they might think that not a lot of things are being done because we're not there yet. We're not able to handle these massive challenges with these significant implications, but we can address these challenges. It's that other 5% that can be a little challenging. What do we do with methane from dairy farms? What do we do with methane from wastewater treatment plants? What do we do with methane from landfills? Ultimately, a lot of climate advocates want to move completely away from methane. And I think that for us to get to the CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere, there has to be some type of energy transition. But the question still stands, what would we do with the methane from all of these facilities that are going to continue to generate methane? So Miami-Dade County is getting ready to embark on a zero waste master plan. Like Dylan said, we're gonna keep generating methane, but Miami-Dade has an ambitious goal of diverting as much waste as possible from landfill. That includes food waste. Like Susan mentioned, a lot of food that goes to landfill is currently edible, yet there's food insecurity crises across the world and across Miami-Dade County. How can we better allocate that food so that way it's getting to people that need it rather than to the landfill where it's generating these greenhouse gases? Questions like that, you know, those are areas that we need to address. So even if we implement our zero waste master plan and we drastically reduce waste to landfill, we'll still be generating methane for a couple decades to come. So I understand the moral hazard of possibly bad actors using this initiative to allow for the potential growth or the continuation for fossil fuel industry. But I think we also need to contend with the moral hazard of what happens if we turn a blind eye and we don't acknowledge how we can better use these facilities that are generating this gas.
And if I could just dovetail one thing, I mean, I agree with pretty much everything Nick said, and it's important to remember a lot of the RNG in the country goes into programs like the renewable fuel standard and low carbon fuel standards that have tracking and verification systems. So, you know, with any new industry, sometimes there's like a Wild West sense of things, and I definitely don't want to give that notion. This is an established technology with some oversight in how it's traded and transacted. And then just Mario, to circle back, I had a thought while Nick was talking, you know, aside from, you know, responsible actors like Miami-Dade County, I think it's important to remember when we talk about moral hazard that the economic incentive provided by RNG and the markets for RNG is actually going to drive innovation as well that could potentially help a number of industries. You know, we have members like Waga Energy, which is a French company, and they have a targeted solution, a technology called the Waga Box, which is particularly aimed at small size landfills, which are often, to Nick's earlier point, overlooked because we have certain methane regulations dependent on the size of a landfill. But when you create this economic signal, it can cause startups and new companies to frankly want to get in that market and earn revenue to potentially innovate and then address emissions from a space that might otherwise just go totally unchecked. So you asked for specific examples, and that is one that came to mind.
Now I'm going to have to look up what a Waga box looks like. That sounds fascinating. So I want to open it up to our distinguished audience here for 4 questions. We already have one question in the chat that comes from Paul, and I'm so sorry, Paul. This is a Portuguese last name that I'm going to butcher. Lusuriaga, and it's a question for Nick. Is the intention of Miami-Dade to divert organics to an AD? I have no idea what an AD is, or to optimize the bioreactor process, I don't know what that means either, of the landfill cells to maximize the methane capture, treatment, and usage? Nick, you're on the spot.
Yeah, so great question, Paul. Before I answer, I just want to provide a little bit of translation. So AD is an anaerobic digester. So similar to what we were talking about earlier with landfills, that's a completely oxygen absent environment. So is an anaerobic digester. It's a machine essentially that has no oxygen at all. You can put food waste in there and it will generate methane for beneficial reuse. So Paul, ultimately, and then regarding the optimization of the bioreactor process, Paul is essentially alluding to whether or not Miami-Dade County would make the infrastructure at our landfills better to help with better capture of methane. So ultimately, this is a two-pronged approach here. Regarding organic waste diversion, we haven't determined if we're going to, use an anaerobic digester or what composting might look like. We are mulching some of our yard waste and having that used for beneficial reuse rather than sending it to the landfill. But we are wanting to divert as much organic waste as possible. And we do collaborate with a number of community-based organizations in Miami-Dade to try to bolster their ability to get food from grocery stores or from farmers to folks in need. So that way that food doesn't go to waste. So one component is diversion. The other component is maximizing our landfill cells to try to get better methane capture. We are going to try to do that as much as possible for two reasons. One, to Dylan's point, methane, when converted from landfill gas to renewable natural gas, that's a commodity that can be sold and used. And from the environmental perspective, the more methane we're capturing, the more we're able to reduce our overall impact as a county and as a department. So it's a two-pronged approach where we'll be diverting as much organic waste as possible so it doesn't go to the landfill, but we'll also try to maximize our ability to capture methane as much as possible as well.
Hey, Mario, I want to just add one thing. It hasn't been said, which is now we have drones and other technologies. Innovation is going to play a big role. And I think, Dylan, you made some of this point. For a while back, people could sort of claim they were capturing this landfill methane, but there really wasn't a way to check it like there is now. And, just a lot of these different technologies and some of the, renewable natural gas technologies, are improving, right? So again, my orientation is to be skeptical and to make sure that each project, as we've all talked about, but we now have that. So even at the federal government level, they can have more stringent, checks and balances. But, again, there are a lot of powerful industries that run these landfills, and they don't want to have high, sort of regulations to meet in terms of capturing the methane. So we're in this moment where we need, the policymakers to hold accountable, because we cannot continue to put this extra potent methane out there. We have the solutions and we have the technologies to sort of really check on it. So let's do that, right? Instead of putting more climate pollution out with all the bad impacts.
Here's a question that I've got. Where are the big waste management companies on renewable natural gas? I mean, I think specifically of Waste Management, which was founded by Miami's own Wayne Huizinga, which is always just like a weird piece of history because he owned the Panthers and the largest waste hauling company in the United States. But anyways,
Blockbuster.
And Blockbuster, which is not
Blockbuster, right?
So yeah, there are large Fortune 500 level companies that deal with our waste, and how are they interacting with the possibility of the renewable natural gas market?
If I can, yeah. You mentioned Waste Management. They're an RNG coalition member and a pretty vital one. Landfill Group, and then Republic Services is another one of the big heavyweights. Just this week, they actually opened in partnership with Amoresco and PG&E out in California, the largest landfill gas to RNG facility in California, which is saying a lot. There's a lot of projects out in California. So yeah, they're heavily invested pretty much across the waste management sector.
Interesting. And what's the sort of big policy change that you folks think would help RNG take off in Florida?
Well, I can say something just generally, which is right now, we don't have a limit on dangerous carbon pollution, right? We don't have a policy that does that. So what that results in is that we allow the polluters to pollute for free while we're all paying for it. So if at some level, and to me, it's I'm not, married to a particular way of dealing with it, but if you limit the pollution, some people want to tax it, some people want to cap and trade, some people want to cap and dividend. There are different mechanisms for addressing that. But the bottom line is if that doesn't have a value, then they can just keep polluting. So I think that's still in maybe sort of what you were getting at. So if that value is there, then there is an incentive to do the clean thing, right? Because, there's funding and incentives built in and so forth. So that's what we need. We need to limit this climate pollution, and then whatever the mechanisms or combination of mechanisms that provide the incentives on moving to these clean, like this new project you're talking about in California, or the kinds of things Miami-Dade's doing, we've got to move with deliberate speed there.
Yeah, I will say, Florida, and not to make things antagonistic, but it is behind some other states in the country in terms of creating some of these climate programs and decarbonization programs. I won't tell you what RNG Coalition's exact recommendation for Florida is, because frankly, I'll leave that to our lobbyists. But I can give you a sense of what kind of programs we generally advocate for at the state level, which include clean fuel standards, which, California is the golden example of that, where you create a carbon intensity threshold for fuels that lowers over time. Also, you have your clean heat standards. So now we're talking about the utility level. And those can tap a number of different technologies, including, heat pumps, as well as solutions like RNG, and then renewable gas standards like California's or Oregon's, which actually set like a target threshold to blend into the utility gas system. So there's a number of different levers the state could pull. Obviously, again, 4 operational right now, but growing. I know Chesapeake has a few projects coming down the pike, and another 8 in planning. So it's, if it's not a running start, it's a trotting start for Florida, and we're hoping to see more to come in the future, more projects like Miami-Dade counties. Yeah, more to come, definitely.
Great, folks. This has been absolutely fascinating, because most of these conversations I have, they can either get very antagonistic or they can be very doom and gloomy. It's very rare that I get to talk about a technology that, or business practice that might actually do some circular economy benefits while reducing greenhouse gas pollution. With that, we've got 4 minutes left. That means each of you gets 1 minute for a closing statement or thought, or you can just, leave it in silence that we can all enjoy. Don't suggest you do that, but that's a possibility. Nick, I'm going to start with you, sir. Put you on the spot.
Yeah, once again, I appreciate the invitation to speak about some of the work that's being done in Miami-Dade County and what we're trying to do to mitigate our environmental impact from our landfills. I think this is a really, really interesting conversation. Ultimately, at least from a solid waste perspective, I think what's really important in my take-home message is that no matter what, even if we stop generating waste tomorrow, we're still going to be generating methane in our landfills, and we have to figure out a way to either beneficially use that or just prevent it from it being generated, or capturing it in some way, shape, or form and storing it. And given that methane capture and storage is quite a ways away, and methane is mostly being used for beneficial use, I think that we need to be identifying ways to use landfill gas rather than burning it anyway.
Right. Susan, Dylan?
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me today. I appreciate the opportunity just to be part of a discussion that I hope continues to push this innovation, and that we get these good kinds of projects. It's not easy to address, climate pollution. There's lots of pieces to it, and this is just one piece, right? But we got to do this piece. And so I'm just thrilled that you need leaders. You need leaders who will, just kind of plow ahead and make sure that we're sort of testing the different approaches and different technologies and innovations. And someone's got to be that, those leaders. And we've got some in Florida and we've got lots around the country, but we need to do more. So, that's it. I mean, this is affecting our lives now. It's not something, climate change has been so perceived as something down the road, like it's kind of far in the future. And that allowed, politicians or others to just kick the can down the road. And then, and I would be, insincere if I just didn't acknowledge the, misinformation that the fossil fuel industry and utilities have put out there decades and decades and hundreds of millions of dollars, just simply to confuse people. So, be not confused anymore. Climate pollution is warming the planet and melting the ice caps and warming our oceans and supercharging our storms. And it is taking the people and the places that we love. The good news is we have the solutions. We just need to have the will and continue to innovate, and then we can do this thing. So I am hopeful, actually, Mario, you acknowledge that. I mean, we can do this thing, but we only have a few years, to try to kind of resurrect this and turn the clean energy or the energy super tanker around to clean. So thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure, Susan. And Dylan, final word.
Yeah, if I can, just thanks to my co-panelists, Susan and Nick. It's been great, very productive discussion. I concur with what a lot of both of you said in terms of, the importance of climate impacts. Whether we're talking about renewable natural gas or biomethane, the phrase I would want people to walk away with is methane capture. Regardless of what end of the political spectrum you're on, we need to increase awareness about the impact of methane on our climate and do everything that we can to capture that methane and try to use it productively and responsibly. Again, if you look at what countries like Denmark are doing, 40% biomethane in their gas system. We need to be more ambitious in this country and in North America more broadly, and sometimes set our political differences aside and try and leverage wind, leverage solar, heat pumps, RNG. We just want to be a part of a solution that can compete and be a part of a sustainable energy transition. So thanks again, Mario. This has been great.
My
Amen.
pleasure, folks.
Visit rngcoalition.com for more information about RNG.
There you go. Well, hey, thank you so much, everybody. Have a wonderful day. Susan, good luck. Dylan, stay safe. And if anybody needs any help in Miami, I have family there. So let me know, okay? Bye, folks. Thank you.
Thanks, folks.
Thank you, everyone. Stay safe, Susan.
Yep.